Well, what I want to do is I know I talked last week, because I couldn't get my slideshow. I want you to see this film because I think it explains some, and it might give you some insight on why I'm different than most. But give you an insight on sort of some of my pastoral formation prior to coming here, right? What I want to do is start with, this is the founding text that we would dwell in. I talked about dwelling in the Word. We dwell on this for 4 years, this Lydian group. And this is the story of Lydia, where the name of the community came. So, I'll just read it. And again, I want to ask you to sort of keep in mind what jumps out. I'm going to ask some questions, and I'm just curious. What jumps out as we talk? And this is Paul and Timothy and Silas. So they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. When they had come opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus didn't allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia and being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them, we set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in the city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come stay at my home." And she prevailed upon us. And we won't do the full dwelling thing, but I'm curious, when you were listening to that, what jumped out? I did this for 4 years. I mean, I know this intimately.
Why were the disciples forbidden to go to Asia and what was it, Phrygia?
Yeah. We don't know. But that's what they reported. They were forbidden by the Spirit and forbidden by Jesus, right? Let's go back here.
I thought, so what made that happen? Was a large river put in that place so that they couldn't cross it? I mean, how did was there a wall that said, Christians not wanted? I mean,
we don't know.
Isn't that interesting?
But they call out, look at this. He calls out forbidden by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And forbidden by the Spirit of Jesus. So there's some interesting things about that. What does it mean? There's no footnotes on this, right?
Right.
But why the Spirit of Jesus? Why the Spirit of the Lord, right? The Holy Spirit and the Spirit of Jesus. And this kept not haunting us, but this kept coming around. What does it mean to be forbidden? And remember, they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, and I think their intention was to go to Asia, but they were forbidden. Something happened that they felt that God had forbidden them, the Holy Spirit had forbidden them to go on. So then...
Was Asia in war? I mean, were they,
Well, this would have been into Asia. For them, it would have been into probably India.
India.
Right? If you look at the map, I don't have the map here, but
okay.
I think we're talking India. Something prevented them. Maybe they were turned back by bandits, or maybe it just didn't feel right. Maybe they prayed and said, "This is not where we're being called to go." Right? So that was this opening part. The Spirit forbidding us, or didn't want us to, did not allow them. So, we talked about this sometimes. It would say, when we were thinking about things we wanted to do or we felt that we should do, and then when things would be difficult or too hard, would we say, this is how we started thinking. and based on this story, are there things that we're doing that we're not paying enough attention to the things that are happening to say, well, maybe we're not supposed to be here. Maybe we shouldn't be putting that, doing this particular ministry or trying to. And I think eventually we begin to realize that the co-working community itself was a tool, but not the ultimate end. And this is part about listening to God and all that. So, any other thoughts? Any other thoughts? I think it's interesting that Paul had a vision, right? It's not that the strategic plan worked, or that he looked in the hymnal, or there was the guide from the church saying that this next strategic step is to go into so and so. He had a vision about a man from Macedonia who said, "Come on, we need your help." Fascinating.
It's also interesting that Lydia's household was baptized. So,
yeah,
I'm a Muslim, and all of a sudden my master says you have to be baptized as a...
And there's the thing, households weren't just family.
No.
Right.
So you got slaves being baptized.
Unnamed. Could have been children, could have been adults, could have been non-believers.
Yeah.
She was a person of God, but...
And power.
Yeah, she had some power, right? She was a dealer in purple cloths. She had economic power. Purple cloth was what? The purple was the color of royalty and power. And what I did some research on this, it was very expensive to make because purple cloth was made from like the carcass of a certain type of beetle or something like that.
I was just going to say from the inside of an acorn.
Is that?
You break open an acorn and the outer shell will give you red. It won't give you purple, but it'll give you a very deep red.
Right.
I know that.
Yeah. And I think this came from a particular beetle.
Okay.
And they'd have to capture and cultivate these beetles in order to get the purple. So the purple ink. So it was very expensive.
Very expensive.
And she worked with at least the buyers of royalty, and being in Philippi. Why was she in Philippi? She was from Thyatira, right? That's another region away. Philippi was the capital city, a colony, a Roman colony that had been built upon a smaller Macedonian city. But this is where the head of the colonial Roman power was, where economic power, where military power, where educational power was all situated in that part in Philippi. And she was there because of the economic, and that's where the rulers were, right?
Sure.
Very interesting thing. I like here, the Lord opened her heart.
Yeah.
It wasn't that Paul was such a great, and Paul didn't bring her to Jesus, right? It wasn't Paul's gift that caused the conversion of Lydia. It was the Lord opened her heart. So you have a lot of this is Acts in a nutshell, these interesting things. So we go back here, and I'm going to go on to the next stage. We actually did this with a group. Okay, so this is sort of the story of the beginnings of Lydia Way. I prepared this video some years ago, 2 years ago, for a presentation we did to the Grand Canyon Synod in Arizona about the possibility of adapting some of these things in their synod. We have two Lydians are engaged there. So it's still an ongoing hope that we get to do something there, some of this stuff. But I'm going to go ahead and play this video. Hey, sound.
Lydia Place was formed as a synodically authorized worshiping community of the St. Paul Area Synod in August 2013. Now, initially we were committed to exploring and testing alternative ways to sustain and resource a new word and sacrament community without making it dependent upon congregational giving as our primary income source. After After a year and a half of research and study and strategy, we decided to open a co-working space, which would on weekdays support entrepreneurs and self-employed professionals, folks who frequently worked at home and had no need for full-time separate office, but who also occasionally needed access to workspace or meeting space and other business resources, and also could use access to a community of like-minded folks when it was so often missing for the self-employed or differently office professionals. Perhaps most importantly, Lydia Place would also offer a faith-based community that would allow people to explore how their faith and their economic vocation intersected. This space itself and the potential income it generated would in time, we believe, support a more conventional Word and Sacrament Sunday morning worshiping community. South St. Anthony Park seemed to be the perfect location for this. In the heart of the Twin Cities, it was an eclectic mix of industrial and warehouse space, of century-old houses, and apartment buildings, and artist lofts, and office space. The neighborhood was also home to a large group of artists and makers, and surprisingly, the largest concentration of nonprofit organizations in the Upper Midwest, all drawn by the central location and cheap rent. But it was also a neighborhood in transition. The Green Line Light Rail project, which was the largest public works project in Minnesota history, one that connected downtown Minneapolis to the University of Minnesota, right through our neighborhood to the state capitol, and finally to downtown St. Paul. This was being built as we were opening up. An estimated 5,000 to 8,000 new apartment units were expected to be built along the Green Line within a mile or so either way of us, along with scores of retail and commercial business space, bringing in scores of young, hip-connected, and upwardly mobile professional workers, the kind of folks who may want to join a young, hip-connected, and mobile faith community. Of course, when we set up shop, the neighborhood wasn't exactly bustling. Everything was in a state of disruption and chaos. It was grubby and messy and chaotic, but we loved it and thought we were on the right track. And then we met Linda. It was late April 2014, and she was interested in joining our new co-working community. When Linda arrived, she immediately told us she was a published writer and was hoping to be published again. But she also told us that she was bipolar, living on public assistance and couldn't afford to pay. "I'm poor," she said, "and nobody thinks poor people have skills." We told her that money was not a barrier, but to her the space was both too confining and too open, too loud and too quiet, exactly what she needed but not what she wanted. And then she abruptly left. 30 seconds later, I swear, Linda opened the office door and said, "You're a church, aren't you?" And we said, "Yes, we are part of the ELCA." And at this, words just tumbled out. I live at Seal High Rise, the big public housing tower just up the street. The people who live there are poor and disabled too. We haven't had church there for 2 years. The last people who did church there, I think it was the Catholics, when they left, they took their damn piano. And then she paused. "Will you be our church?" she asked. Tommy and I looked at each other, and for whatever reason, we nodded and said, "Sure." And she prevailed upon us. Within 3 weeks, we began leading Sunday worship at Seal High Rise. For Lydia, something had changed. We had crossed a threshold. Our carefully constructed, neat and tidy long-term strategy and vision for a faith-centered co-working community had been disrupted, and we weren't quite sure why. Why did we, without hesitation, say yes to Linda's request? Why did we so suddenly step outside of our own carefully curated work and worship space to sing, pray, and break bread with folks who suffered from poverty, struggled with physical disabilities and mental illness, people who were socially outcast and totally invisible to the hipper and more connected folks of the neighborhood? These were not the kind of people who would frequent a co-working space. These were not the kind of people who would be able to give to a collection plate. They weren't hip or plugged in. They were the exact opposite of the target demographic for our newly planted co-working community. But they were lovely. and open and loving and devoted. And so Lydia trudged on, caught between our long-term vision of a co-working community and our newly accepted invitation to minister to the folks at Seal Highlands. Something new had awakened in us. Instead of asking, what is God up to, we now asked, why is God doing this other way? And what does that mean for us as faithful followers of Christ? In time, Lydia realized that as our vision for and our commitment to a co-working community had grown clearer, our focus had narrowed to the point that we were missing other signs of God's activity and call. What was God actually up to? And for Lydia Place, this marked a period of intense and exciting growth and regrowth as we begin to intentionally discern, as persons and as a community, God's activity among us, in and around us, in places and ways we had never noticed before. And as we begin to notice how God was calling us to use our gifts to join in the Spirit's ongoing creative and redemptive work. And this discernment and openness to the Spirit's invitation then led to a number of new collaborations and relationships. Some were close to us, others were remote. Some were active, others were more passive. Some were local, others regional, others national, and even global. But all were linked and connected through Lydia Place, we believe, by the work of the Holy Spirit. And although many, if not most, of these new relationships and collaborations were unexpected, they were all welcome. And through them, Lydia was led to proclaim the news and serve the need we never have imagined on our own. Ways we never would have experienced had we stuck to the original plan. From worshiping out of offered space at an art gallery, while live streaming to a broader audience long before that became a coded necessity, to working with students at Lutheran Seminary around innovation, leadership, and discernment. From active leadership in local policy and advocacy through the St. Anthony Park Community Council, which in turn advised the city of St. Paul on policy matters, to an active partnership with the local community garden and restaurants and other stores to bring free, fresh, organic vegetables to the residents of Seal High Rise through our Sunday Table program. We hosted a monthly bluegrass beer and hymn sing at a local Irish pub with my band, The Flesh Pots of Egypt, to the introduction of Lydian discerning practices to congregations which were under interim. From sharing the Lydia Way at innovation summits and preaching conferences to collaborating with theologians and other faith leaders around the globe. At the same time, that one-year long-term planning process that led us to co-working had failed to result in a thriving co-working space. The more we discerned the Spirit's call, the more we saw unexpected invitations and opportunities emerging from the periphery of our vision and understanding. Now, it was only when we weren't so focused on our strategic plan that we could really see and pivot to the activity, invitation, and opportunities which were emerging. Once the Spirit took our blinders off, a new type of community emerged. A community which strove to follow the lead of the Holy Spirit, one guided not so much by a particular path, but which over time assumed a stance or posture of openness to the movement and invitation of the Holy Spirit. One which learned to trust God's call, God's invitation, and step joyfully into where the Spirit was leading, even if we were not sure where it would take us. And perhaps more central to our conversation today, another foundational shift in thinking began to emerge, one which hits at the very heart of how communities of faith plan and prepare for the future. For some time now, decades even, there is a trend in the church and certainly in the ELCA to adopt and adapt management strategy and planning methods from the corporate world. And it has spawned quite an industry with hundreds, if not thousands, of books and methodologies written on the subject. Hundreds, maybe thousands of businesses and consultants and organizations devoted to helping churches and communities thrive and grow. The language of corporate America has entered into everyday church vernacular too, with terms like vision casting, and SWOT analysis, and gap analysis, and action plan, and core competencies, and viable goals, and stakeholders, and the like. These terms appear almost as frequently as do prayer and liturgy, witness and service, vocation and call, especially in our planning groups, church councils. In many cases, too many cases, we believe the church has treated strategic planning as a plug-and-play component of everyday congregational management, mission, and vision. Yet we still cannot plug and play these types of concepts into the church. And there are a number of reasons why. The church, like any organization, does have stakeholders, but they aren't those who invest in and lead the church, we believe. Not the members or the council or the pastors or deacons and other leaders. They're not the biggest givers or the hardest working volunteers or the loudest voices. They're not the Senate staff, not the bishop, not even the LCA headquarters in Chicago. Rather, Lay proclaims that the stakeholders of the church are those whom Christ calls us to love and serve. The neighbor, the other, people who experience hunger and hopelessness, sickness and despair. Indeed, the entirety of creation itself. And secondly, when adapted by the church, conventional strategic planning practices are by nature designed to focus on our activity, our desires, our needs, our wants. The language is so predominantly internally focused. In his large catechism, Martin Luther wrote that there were three things that contend against God: the powers of the world, the devil, and our sinful selves. But when we use any of these as the primary basis for our strategies and plannings, especially our own wants and desires, then a very important question looms. Is the church's mission and vision aligned with God's mission and vision? Thirdly, conventional linear strategic planning does not work well in times of transition and disruption, in a liminal age such as ours. If you're not familiar with the term, liminal comes from the Latin limen, meaning threshold, or a passageway from one room to another, one space to another, one age to another. And the word liminal does not only refer to physical passageways, but also passageways of time, environment, and meaning. And there's no doubt that we are moving from one age to another. From modernity to post-modernity to hyper-modernity, some would say. From analog information to digital information, institutions to networks, hierarchical organizational structures to flatter, collaborative, and co-equal structures. No matter how you describe it, the world we live in, the culture we move in, the church we love and serve is caught up in a time of transition, a liminal season, perhaps a liminal age. Everything is changing. The institutions we depend upon, the truths we hold as immutable, the rhythms of work and life and family, everything is changing. And with the disruption of COVID, it's more visible and tangible than ever. Now, it's been 8 months or so since the pandemic shutdowns began to disrupt our communities, our families, our schools, our churches. And if any of our particular ministries were already wrestling with the challenges of this liminal age, how to manage and find your way through the growing uncertainty and disruption, and the utter chaos brought about by the pandemic has certainly hastened its coming and thrust us all right into the middle of it. We have all found ourselves having to rapidly pivot, adapt, to pull back and regroup, to reassess, to rethink, retool, only to have to turn around and redo it all again. In many ways, our careful strategies and best laid plans have been derailed, have they not? Our future is not as clear as it once was. And it's almost impossible to think 1, 3, 5 years in advance if we cannot be sure of what will be happening a month from now, a week from now, tomorrow, even this afternoon. And for Lydians, it's clear that in order to navigate this coming and uncertain future, the way that we approach it must adapt and change. We can no longer set our sights on a straight course to an idealized future point. That path disappears into the fog all too easily. And it's increasingly likely that even before we get into the fog, the path will change. But rather, we might need to adopt a stance or a posture that allows us to pivot, to move, to change course, not only in response to the challenges that suddenly appear in our vision, but also the opportunities that the Holy Spirit calls us into. We call these tools, this mindset, the agile posture necessary to flourish in this liminal age, the Lydian way. We'll get into some of these tools later today.
Okay, so that goes on. But in some respects, this shows you sort of where I was coming from even before I interviewed. Thinking, even before I had the opportunity to interview with this congregation about what is going on in the world and the church organizations. Of course, it was different for a new start who was totally unencumbered by history and tied to a plant and tied to long-time relations, family relationships, relationships with certain forms and practices and rites that have become so ingrained in our language and in our action that we aren't able, or it's harder to see other opportunities that arise. So that is where Lydia came in. Now Lydian's still going. We're just a separate nonprofit, and there's no pay. In many ways this is my ongoing academic work that accompanies my work. And then there's so many things going on since this video. It says 8 months since the pandemic. That was a year and October, so it's been 22 months or 24 months since this pandemic. So what stood out for you in that? What sort of caught your imagination, good or bad? Some of the assumptions we might have made, or
I thought the visuals are kind of funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you capture those visuals though? That's the thing. How do you share some of these images and with which you're talking about interesting things, different things?
I thought it was interesting that an older person came and said, "We need church."
Yeah.
I really think that all the churches are missing out on the seniors.
Mm-hmm.
The people in the care centers and the shores and all the I took somebody around yesterday for a tour, and that was one of her questions. Do we have church here?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a place where we can have church?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, during COVID, a priest came and they sat outside and they got communion. And I said, no, otherwise there isn't.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a chapel. And as you grow older, we are the age of people that go to church. And then all of a sudden we don't have church. I don't understand that. It's like, okay, I still want to go to church. I still want to sing the hymns.
Mm-hmm.
I might not be able to sing at all then, but I want to hear it. And so I think...
Consider our shores worship as 22 to 25 people routinely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's not a nursing home. People that live there are independent. If they need help, they pay big bucks.
Yeah.
But, a lot of them are still going to church. Bridget used to come to church all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And Harry and Dorothy used to come to church.
Did they both live up there?
They lived there for a while, and then Dorothy passed away, and then you know, it was too hard for Harry to live alone. He couldn't.
Yeah, we have a number of members over there.
Yes,
People who are still members, they still contribute to the church.
right.
For them to be able to have the pastor come on Wednesday or Thursday,
Oh,
whenever
yes.
it is
I mean, that'd
Thursday.
be huge.
It's very important.
Mhm.
I plan on going there. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet or when, but I'm planning on going over there on Thursday and Good Friday.
Mhm.
And I might even try to make a quick trip Easter.
Mhm.
You know, I imagine things will pretty clear out. Well, I don't, because we're not having, we might have coffee, but we're not going to have adult ed. I might go over afterwards and do an Easter celebration with them. Because for me, that is not, once I've been involved, I don't see it as a contract sort of situation. I see it as part of our, it's one of our communities.
Right, a mission.
Yeah. And that mission, that particular mission is part of what we do, and we were invited into that. And they're happy right now. We're in a good state with that. The question is, I guess, those opportunities are going to come to us, and they're there all the time. It's, do we see them, and are we able to, like I say, pivot? Right? When Lydia first started, we had this, I wasn't young, but in a lot of ways I was young, and I was trying to think, we were really focused on, one of the problems that bedeviled New Starts was, how do you fund a church when the only thing the church knows is member support, right? Member giving. And when that's okay when you have an established church and people who are in established careers, and it tends to favor the middle class more so than the poor.
Yep.
Though you'll be surprised, some of these poor churches that are primarily poor people, how flush they are, how people really. The other thing is that as churches become more established, and there was this whole pattern of growth in the 60s, 70s, post-World War II, the baby boom, where everything was booming in the country and people were establishing lives, young people, and raising families and their careers and all. And part of what was central to life was the church, that we kept on adding on and building on and doing things so we could accommodate all the people who were gathered.
Mhm.
But as people left, for whatever reason it dwindled, and I think part is that the church never did realize it still, in some extent, doesn't have a sense of why people aren't coming back or going elsewhere. There's more coming back than going elsewhere, I really think. Not coming back than going elsewhere. Part of the thing that happened, like in 2007, 2006, 2008, during that bust, people had taken on huge building projects, and then they couldn't afford it anymore. Churches were closing down because they were going broke, or they were having to cut programs and really rethink what's going on. But that rethinking, in a way, it's a winnowing process, and a refinement process for who we are as church, forcing us to ask those questions: what is truly essential to Christian community?
You know, you're told by, okay, so I only work part-time. Okay, so when my kids were growing up, I mean, they're 50 now. My daughter works full-time.
Mm-hmm.
Husband works full-time. You're told to keep your kids in sports and music,
Mm-hmm.
so that they have a broader sense of who they are and keep them away from the drug situation, know where they are all the time. You cannot be a superhero and go to church. I mean, literally, it's like, if I don't have one day a week where I can just stay home and put my feet up and maybe look at a book, I'd be crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where my daughter's at. You know, she said, we're trying to go to church every other Sunday. You know, my granddaughter's in confirmation, so she's, got to go at least once in a while. But, they're in martial arts and music and theater and, oh my goodness.
Well, we were a soccer family before I went to seminary, and still were when I was.
So,
And So when you're a student or you're a pastor and those Sunday tournaments come up, what do? You know?
Yeah.
We did a lot of that. We actually went to church. Kelly being Catholic, we go to Catholic church. There was always a 5 o'clock mass somewhere. But we looked at Lutheran churches too, and that was part of what we did. We also had evening worship.
But you wouldn't be necessarily going to your church.
No.
You'd be finding a church that has a Wednesday night service. You know, or finding one that has a Saturday night service. You know, we tried to do a Saturday night service here. We really pushed for a while. And, you know, that didn't work either, so.
It's hard, because Saturday night tends to be social night for lots of people, and or the weekends are off.
Yeah.
We had a Sunday night worship at St. James that for a while was pretty popular, but then people started saying, oh, but 7 o'clock at night, I don't get to 8:30. Yeah, this is, that has all changed, this commitment. And so, we question. I think what part of what this whole thing about I was trying to get across into words here was that how we as congregations, as congregational leaders, as congregational members, think about what our future is really being called into question, because nothing is as stable and sure as it once was, or at least it once seemed. And this agileness. Now, it takes a while for people to learn and see, and it takes practice. It takes ways to get into that, where our councils and our members are able to say, oh, there's this invitation. Something's happening over here. I used to think about this was Lydia, right? I could see you four, but I can barely see Nancy out the corner of my eye, when I turn. I can see the periphery. Well, Nancy might be beckoning me something that's very, very important, but if my blinders are on, I'm so focused on. And to tell you the truth, pastors haven't been taught that for years. It's just the last decade or so that we've really been focused on that. And what does it mean? And what does it mean when we see things to come to the trust that it is the Holy Spirit, like Paul having the vision from the man from Macedonia jumping in and going straight to it, or Lydia asking him to come and stay with us if you have found me to be faithful, and she prevailed upon us. What does it mean to allow oneself to be prevailed upon? And what does it mean to say, it's pretty evident now that this mystery or this effort, God's saying, don't go to Asia. Don't go, it's not going to work for you. And honestly, that's one of the things that really drew me here when we first had some of the first interviews and I got the MSP and started talking to the call committee, was that there was this sense of other people I met, that there's this openness to that kind of thinking. You'd already experienced things that had drawn you out of a pretty straightforward way of doing things and moving forward. And I know it's talk about strategy and those kind of things, but it's, as leaders, you've got to navigate the world. You've got to navigate the powers. I think we've had, in the 8 months I've been here, some pretty amazing opportunities arise. We've had some loss that we've had to endure, more loss. But in each one of those losses, that's opened up opportunities that I think could be amazing. And I think there's more to come. It's whether we can learn together how to embrace it and how to recognize it. So one of the tools that Lydia used was this dwelling in the Word. Getting deeply into a text to start listening to what God is calling us to, as opposed to as opposed to expecting to just like that a Bible study. I think it's important that when we Bible study here, and that you are willing to say, yeah, I'm hearing this in the text, and then not expect me to say this is what it means, right? I think Bible studies sometimes get to that point. The expert's going to present the Bible to you, and you're going to learn what it is, instead of saying your experience, your sense of things have as much validity as mine. Mine might be informed by certain things, maybe education, sometimes by the mood I'm in, right? Trying to be honest. So this dwelling is one of those things that I do, and I've introduced here, where I want to use in our different groups, our leadership groups, where we're going to continue to dwell in these same texts, where it becomes regular practice for us to listen deeply and pay attention to what's jumping out to us before we even worry about what the teacher or the pastor or whoever has to say. Does that make sense? And you don't have to... I like it. I think you guys are great when we do that. The conversations are just rich as can be. That kind of study. I'm going to... What time do we have? 11:32, so we only have a few minutes. Is that right? 11:33?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
One thing I want to tell you about is that I do, and this is what I do twice a week with a group of people from Arizona, Texas here. Some pastors, some not. A professor of theology. We practice Rose Huddle, and it's a spiritual practice that gives me, helps grind me. This is my weekly spiritual practice. I do it twice during the week, an hour at a time, with a group of people. Every Wednesday morning at 9:15, and every Thursday at 1:15. That's when we meet, because we have some people in Arizona. And if you didn't know anything about Arizona, they have their own time, right? Sometimes it's 10:15, sometimes it's 11:15, because they... And one's a former student that I had when I was at the seminary. She's now a pastor in the Phoenix area. One's a colleague, a classmate of mine when I first started seminary. She's in Prescott Valley, Arizona. Another is a graphic design friend who's a committed Christian, and we've been friends since 1987. And the other group here is a professor, a retired professor from Wesley Seminary in D.C., Methodist, a Lutheran minister, who's an interim minister and is a church consultant, and then the other two people are two of the original Lydians. Yeah, what were you going to say, Sherry?
What does Kairos mean?
Kairos?
Kairos.
Okay, I'm going to explain. In Greek... Oh, thank you. That was theory on it. In Greek, there's two words that describe time. Chronos, like a chronograph, is linear time. Time that just marches on and on, second by second. You're always in the present, moving towards the future, leaving the past behind. That's chronos. But there's also kairos. And kairos means God's time, or sometimes refers to the inbreaking of God's time, which is timeless but also embedded in, we experience through chronos, right? This is God's time. And one of the things about chronos, we call it, about kairos, is that this is a way to look at those times where we think that God might be, this is the process, we think God might be breaking in and saying, pay attention. So there's a process we follow, called the huddle, that helps us discern that. And what we find most often happens is when that happens, there's a little bit different future comes out of it, right? So, does that make sense? Once you listen closely to God and act on that, then your future, the kairos has changed. So it's basically a thing where we get together as a group of 5 or 6 people, and we start with the dwelling in the Word. That's 10 minutes. We share what we heard. We don't start in with a check-in and none of that stuff. We start in the Word. So we start by listening deeply every week to this Word. And then somebody says, I have a kairos, right? I think God's tapping me on the shoulder and nudging me to do something. And so as a leader, I say, okay, tell me about it. Observe. And just what's going on, okay? Well, I was driving down the road and I saw a white squirrel. I've never seen a white squirrel before, right? And the squirrel was dragging a piece of pizza across. I don't know, but I think God might be telling me something about this squirrel and the pizza, right? And so they talk about it, and then the leader asks them to reflect on it. So what do you think God might be in on that? Well, I noticed it was sausage pizza and not pepperoni, right? So maybe, I don't know, I'm just using this as an example, right?
Yeah.
But I think God might be, and they start telling you, and meanwhile the other people in the circle are paying attention, listen carefully. We've already started by listening carefully to the Word. They're listening careful. And we take some time and we just sit in silence and let those thoughts perk. A couple minutes, really. Then we come back and the person who's bringing the kairos becomes the listener. And we start discussing this. And the first thing to discuss is that everybody around the circle can ask a clarifying question. So you were saying it was a white squirrel. Did it have a black tip to its tail or was it a white tip? Or are you sure it was pizza? Could it have been a piece of cardboard? Or you were talking about this and you started to say what kind of tree it was, and you sort of stopped yourself. Why? You go back to so these, and this is never how it goes, but you start asking these questions. Everybody asks a clarifying question. You never offer a solution. Well, what I would think is that is, right? I think you should have shot this squirrel and had it for dinner. Right? That with the pizza. Squirrel pizza. So, and then, once everybody's offered that clarifying question, we go around and say, do you have an offering for the person who's got the kairos? And that offering is, we pay attention to a Bible verse, a story, a character, a theme that comes up. We try to keep it faith-based. But so you might say, here's my offering, okay? To you, you're bringing about the squirrel. Do you remember the story of Balaam and his talking donkey? Okay? That's what came to my mind. And I offer that to you. I don't know what it means necessarily, but I offer it to you. Because we're all trusting through the listening, through the conversation, through the interaction, that God's somehow present. Now, it's never that ludicrous. But so everybody that gives their offering, we sit in silence for just a little bit. And then, I need a better word than plan. To go back to the person who brought the kairos and said, now that you've told us what you've observed, what's going on, might be about a job, might be about a relationship, might be about something specific to the work they're doing, an offer or
family.
A family. It might be something about. Yeah, it might be something about. So, one of the guys has got this ongoing kairos we're working on now. He's a pastor, doing interim work, and he also does consulting work. And he's really feels maybe more drawn to consulting, but maybe not consulting with the group he's in, but maybe going with somebody else and start a new church consulting organization. Which means financially, that's a risk, right? So he's working this out because God keeps working on him. And so we go back and say, okay, the plan first. Who are you? What does all this say about who you are in Christ? We're going to ground it back into our identities before we ground it in action. Well, I am a beloved child of God who have a gift for spotting strange animals with food products. Right? That's who I am. And so, because of that, then what might God be asking you to do? And almost always it brings clarity. And so we say, well, how are we going to know that you did that? What are you going to do? Well, I'm going to take the first chance and I'm going to take pictures of the squirrel next time I see it. And then next time we get together and say, hey dude, did you take pictures of the squirrel? And that's a practice that I hope at some point we can have a couple huddles here of people who are interested in, as we think through our lives, it can be about our personal lives, it can be about the lives of the church, that this becomes a practice. Now, it's not something that you just do once a few times and leave, This becomes a spiritual practice. I've been doing huddles since 2013. 9 years almost, 8.5 years. I've been in a huddle or leading huddles. And it's changed the way that the call to the call to cross was part of several huddles as I was discerning. You know, it wasn't something I did on my own trying to figure this out. This is done in community. And what it does on top of that is it builds strong community. And it becomes a spiritual practice that I need and my friends need. I have one guy who says, I go to church, I teach confirmation on the west side. He says, but this to me is the best church. This is the most important church. This is my connection to God more than anything is you four guys. Because there's 5 of us in the house. And it's all men. The other one is half men, half women, right? And but it becomes these intensely wonderful relational spaces where we really get to know each other and our families and lives. And you really depend on that, but it's all grounded in Scripture and listening to God. So that's the Kairos huddle. A couple other I think I put together. Yeah, we're not going to do that. Okay. I'll go back to a couple others. So, other tools that we use. You've already seen this one, narrative discernment. That I do strongly believe that the stories of faith, and if we look at, if we try to understand the Bible in terms of how the stories are presented, right? Not stories as in falsehoods, not stories as in fiction, but narrative, because that's how humans share things. More realistically, we share through story. And especially in ancient cultures, they shared through stories. The more we can discern and get used to listening for God's story, we begin to more easily see how God's story is being played out in our story. And those places where our story deviates, right, or maybe comes into conflict with God's story is. So like I said this summer, let me tell you a story. It was a simple introduction. Going into the narrative lectionary is a very important thing because it draws us deeper into this gospel, especially John, than you would in the RCL is beautiful, but it's sort of disjointed. It jumps from place to place. Dwelling in the Word is a different way of discerning through the narrative, through the story. And to see where that story, and the more we dwell and the more we're familiar, here's the other thing, and it doesn't apply to you mostly, I would say mostly, it doesn't apply to us in this congregation, especially those of you gathered here, as much as it does in a general world and in bigger congregations. But what we've noticed through research and other things is that the story of God's love in the world is less and less a central part of our own cultural awareness. I talked about that in the narrative lectionary. Remember when in the 50s and the 60s, when Sunday morning where TV was all full of the mainline churches, right? And the Bing Crosby Christmas special, guess what? He sang these beautiful Christmas hymns, you know, not the ones that are made for pop stars like Mariah Carey and stuff now, right? It's the cult in the schools. In the early part of the last century, the weekly readers, the primary readers, had Bible verses in them and poems about Adam and Eve and those basic biblical stories. Well, they're all gone now. And there are all other stories. Frustrates the heck out of me that Christmas, from Hallmark to the cartoons, are so much about Santa, and everybody knows the meaning of Christmas. But nobody ever talks about the meaning of Christmas being a celebration of God, Emmanuel, God with us, right? It's always about family or love, and it is, right? But that distinctly Christian narrative is gone. So if we dwell more in narrative, we teach it more, we dwell in it more together as community, not just as individuals, then what we found is that we can identify and we have some clarity about where God is calling us. Something we call the radical yes. Why did we say yes to Linda? We were hopping, man. You know, things were hopping. That Linda. Oh, you weren't here, Jim. But this homeless, not homeless, person living in a public housing society, poor, bipolar. She said, people who think that people are poor don't have skills. And she was a writer. That was just stuck in our, you know. When she said, will you be our church? And we're hanging out, you know, around the coffee table, drinking coffee and writing and talking these concepts and thinking about work and internet and all that stuff. She comes in and said, will you be our church at Steel High Rise? And you saw the folks there. Rosie and Jean, and a lot of those people are gone now. They died. COVID took our folks. As a matter of fact, all those people you've seen, I think only one is really active in that community anymore, or would be if we were back. We haven't been back since COVID, other than the food program. But we started thinking about, churches talk about being radically hospitable, radical hospitality. You've heard that over and over and over. That's okay, that's wonderful. We should be radically hospitable. We should have our hospitality should extend to anybody. But sometimes we only think in hospitality in terms of who's coming in our doors, or coming into our circles, or coming into our sphere of influence. We never think about those invitations where we're asked to go into somebody else's. And I'll admit, I did not want to go into Steel High Rise. Smelled the bad trash and urine, and there were bugs, cockroaches, and a lot of people that I was uncomfortable around, in wheelchairs, and body odors, and you know, all that stuff. I'll be honest, I wasn't quite sure about that. I've always struggled a little bit with settings like that, and I think partly because I had a wife in comatose for 6 months, and a young woman, I'm in and out of care centers and hospitals and stuff. That ICU still give me the heebie-jeebies. But I'm called into ICU to be with people, and I can take that experience into it. But what about when somebody comes and says, hey, I'm poor, I'm bipolar, would you be our church? We said yes. And so we talk about it, Lydia, being the radical yes. When you're invited into something, you say yes, and then you try to figure out what to do with it.
Exactly.
You don't say the invitation, let me talk to the Borderland Ministries. Right?
Let me talk to Jim Border.
Yeah.
See what he thinks.
Yeah, let's talk to the... so I called Sherry, and Sherry says, well, I have to talk to the whole the group. And then she'll talk to the group, and they say, well, we need to talk to Jim, you know, or to Diana, or to, people in the congregation. Or we need to run...
I don't know.
Yeah, we need to run this by PPC, right? And so
Give
before
us another
long...
job, right.
the invitations change. We're trying to even say, we just started going, okay, we'll figure it out as we go. We have an okay, we'll figure it out as we go situation, right? And it's going to be resolved. I know it.
Yeah. It helps though that you play music, because I don't play music, so I couldn't go and help. I mean, I could just be their usher, but it helps that you're not thinking of it as a narthex sacristy have to have.
Mm-hmm.
Like the lady was saying, do you have a chapel? No, but we have several rooms where you could have a service.
We gathered in the community room.
It doesn't make any difference where you gather, it's that you gather.
We gathered in the community room, and right about that time I had a friend who's a pastor over in St. Louis Park called and said, hey, do you want some Bibles? or hymnals or something. I said, sure. So I got a bunch of them. I didn't realize it was like 10 cases of them, but anyway. I still have them. I don't know what to do with them. They're in storage. So I have all these Bibles, because I'm young, I'm starting this new ministry, right? Do we need hymnals? We don't need hymnals. No, you know, I'd rather have had him say, do you need a nice projector? We could have used a projector, because we could do everything digitally and show it. Anyway, so while we're there, he says, hey, do you want a cross? Table cross, right? He says, we're not using it. I don't even know where it comes from. It's probably somebody's grandfather gave that, and somebody's still looking for it, and he's in trouble. But he said, take the cross. So we took that cross, and we gather in two chairs, tables like this, or sometimes just around one. Put that cross in the middle. We're all around. I designed my own songbook and worship sheet. Songbook were just songs I could play on the guitar. I did have that gift, right? And we did a simple little liturgy, and it was simplified because of just who we were and how some people and their ability to read. And you know, we had one person who was 70-some years old and lived with cerebral palsy her whole life and been in the wheelchair, Rosie. I had to give Rosie communion with a mouth that didn't really work, right? So those first few times I'm placing that wafer in her, I dropped it down her dress one time, and somebody had to go shit out for me because I wasn't going to reach. I wasn't good, you know. Then I thought, oh God, I can't do this. But they became the most lovely community. And when Rosie died over. We haven't been able to even have a memorial. We've got to figure that out because there's still some issues. But we will. A guy named Jim wasn't even found for 2 weeks. He was dead in his apartment for 2 weeks before they noticed him. Jean died. That's an amazing story. I'll tell you that sometime. When Jean died, it's a long story, but her ashes are supposed to go somewhere down south, and we haven't been able to get it worked out with the funeral home. And her ashes are in my office downstairs because she had no family. Somebody who was kicked out of family because her mother was, and because she had some mental developmental issues. Beautiful woman, feisty as could be, you know. And but there are only like 3 people who are ever part of worship there anymore, even around. So I'm still trying to figure out how that, and plus how do I do that when I have this long, bigger poem? Anyway, but radical, yes. How do we as guests then also extend hospitality to our hosts? When we are the guest somewhere, how can we also be hospitable to our host? How do we honor their barriers and their boundaries? And how are we good, helpful hosts, guests? But the other thing is, the nice thing about guesting, we call it guesting too, is when the church is invited into somebody else's space, like John Glenn Middle School, right? Like the shores of Lake Phelan, like Steel High Rise, you give up some of your power. You no longer can say, well, this is where everything needs to go, right? You no longer can say, these are the times we have to do it because that's when we do things, right? You give up power and you make yourself more vulnerable. And when you make yourself more vulnerable, stronger relationships come out of that. Does that make sense? It's just beautiful stuff. So these are some of the things that have shaped me as a pastor, and I still practice.
So do they make a screen on a pole that will fit into a cylinder so that you could transport it? Because I'm sure that they wouldn't even have space for you to leave a projector and a screen.
With Seal, we didn't do a screen. It was all printed papers.
Okay.
I just had big print. We had a worship order, a full worship order. Okay. And we just sat around the corner, me and my guitar, and my students. The students were really involved. Sometimes they'd preach. Sometimes I'd preach. Nice. We did a full, the same order of worship that we do here, just different songs and maybe a little lighter. A lot of chit chat, a lot of laughter. And then when we started the Sunday table program, the free food program, I used to go get the vegetables before I got to church. Church started at 1, our worship started at 1, I'd go get the vegetables after wherever I was. They had picked them, and I'd bring in coolers, 3-4 coolers full of fresh organic vegetables, and we'd lay them on the table. And right in the middle of that table was the cross and our communion set. It was so cool. And I got pictures of that. I'll show you sometime. And then we'd have our Bibles. We used the Good News Bible because it was one that more people liked. And then on Wednesday we did prayer. For years we did midweek prayer, where we gathered and prayed, but we also walked through the entirety of the Psalms one year. Every week we read a different psalm. So that took 2 years. And then we did all of Proverbs. Let's do it. And we read and we talked about it. It was beautiful. And there'd be 6 people, there'd be 8 people, there'd be 10 people. Sometimes there were some people from Eritrea. Maria was one. These Eritrean Orthodox Christians who had very little English, but they had the Orthodox cross tattooed in their forehead. You saw a couple of them in one of the pictures. That was Maria and Gudai. Gudai was the other name. And Abraha was her husband. And they had a son who was in school who spoke English really well. And he lived in Ibram. Anyway, they were all Orthodox Christians. But they would come and worship with us. There were people who had severe mental illness who, in the middle of worship, would start arguing about something and then storm off. Anyway, neighboring. Outreach is a central foundation we think about in terms of outreach. But whenever you think about outreach, it implies that we have something that you need and something you should take. And you should take it, right? Because we're outreaching, so here's the food, we have this. Unlike, and it's sort of like the idea of the radical welcome, or the radical yes, radical welcome assumes power imbalance, that we have something to welcome you to, but you've got to, when you come to our place, you have to observe certain rules, so that's a power thing. Like this, neighboring, when we say, when we do outreach, we're saying we have something, again, we have something that you need and should take. What if we thought about neighboring, that we are neighbors, and so I don't have anything that you need, that you should take, but you have something, we have something to offer. We meet at the fence or in the park, and it's mutual, right? It's a mutual relational a relationship of equality and mutuality and grace and humility. So for instance, prior to last week, this congregation had relationships of Promesa de Dios in 9 years with the Seventh-day Adventists, and they were rental agreements. We were the renters, we were the leasers, the landlords, and they were the lessees. And that's defined by, that relationship was defined by what? They pay us to use the space. We were approached by another Latino congregation who needed a home. They'd been housed at Hope Lutheran in the west side, in the east side, who's closing, sold their building. And these people had no place to go. It's a small, 20, 25 people, but they worship, right? And they've been worshiping in the Lutheran church, and we had time, Friday nights and Sunday nights. We're not using them, and they wanted to rent space. So we got all the Latino congregations the other night and said, listen, let's rethink how we think about each other. Instead of renters and landlords, what if we were to be the host church and you are our partners in ministry? So we signed a covenant that said just that. That said, and as partners, that also gives them the invitation to say, I can partner with how this building's needs are taken care of. So we had just been talking about this, and one of the guys, this guy's 25, 26, goes, a bunch of us have LLCs. We do roofing, and we do construction, and we do cleanup, and we do all these things. If you ever need that, let us do it. Let us help you. If we can't do it for free, we'll do it at a better price than you're going to get by going over right? And that relationship has all of a sudden changed because we're partners. It's our building. I mean, they understand that. We all understand that. But instead of saying you're bound by, there will be legal agreements, of course. But the legal agreements are different than the relational agreements. And we're neighboring with them instead of... Does that make sense? And I think it's... You watch what's going to happen with this.
Much better verbiage.
Mm-hmm.
You know, after I heard about this, I said, you know, it would be very interesting to have a conversation with the people that make the meals here. You know, and, you know, do they have the covered space? I mean, they're the ones cooking all the time. We're not cooking hardly at all. And, you know, it would be nice to have a lunch together outside.
We're hoping to do a summer music and community, invite the community, and we're going to have, they have bands. They play music. We have musicians, okay? We do some music, they do some music. We can set up a stand out here. We can invite the neighborhoods. We can have food. And for the sake of the neighborhood, when's the last time we've done a free-for-all that everybody's invited?
We did a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And we only had a couple of people come.
Yeah.
We had a bouncy house and that kind of thing. But not many people came.
Yeah.
You know.
And the other thing is...
And only our church. It wasn't any other churches here. They were not invited.
And about a third of this community, between a quarter and a third of this community right now is Latino in our neighborhood. We don't have anybody who speaks Spanish, I think, in the congregation. I don't. I know
One of the Lund boys, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Joel Lund.
Joel might, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't, though.
No.
He
Right?
teaches Spanish.
He teaches Spanish? Why, it's good to know.
Yeah, up in,
More.
See, I know este de las baños. Where's the bathroom? Which I need because of the other one I know really well is dos cervezas, por favor, which means 2 beers, please. I told that when I was at this, they laughed at it. And I learned another one. I've learned another Spanish phrase, and it's nuestro casa es su casa es la casa de Dios, which means our house is your house is the house of God. And that's what I said to them the other night, and when I was at the Seventh Day. And it's not giving away things, but it's opening up these. I really do believe that its relationship is the key to the gospel. Relationship is the key to what Jesus is calling us into. And if we don't even need to model, we're not good enough sometimes. I'm not good enough to model a relationship. But if we start practicing relational ministry, our faith is about relationships, and we build those relationships with all those folks there. Some of the Latinos are going to come and help with the food packing. The pastor from Seventh Day, Ray's going to come. And he speaks Spanish, and he can go talk to people who are coming and say, Buenos dias. Nice to see you. My name's Pastor Ray. I'm here with Cross, and I'm with Seventh Day. You know, all of a sudden, who knows where that takes us? Where God works through that. Okay. 2 more, and then we'll go. Not maybe just 1 more. Presencing. Now, this is getting a little bit into theory. This is something I work at. This is sort of my main academic pursuit right now with Lydia, the work I do on my own. This is my ongoing educational. This is what I'm doing. I'm engaged with this a lot with the Academy of Religious Leadership and the Journal of Religious Leadership. I'm the secretary of this international organization that talks about religious leadership. Most of the people I'm involved with are people from like Luther Seminary and Columbia Seminary and Pittsburgh and Fuller in California and people overseas about what does it mean to form leaders in the church. Not only pastoral leaders, but lay leaders. There's something called Theory U. Okay? It's a change management system that was pioneered, among others, by Otto Schermer, a guy named Otto Schermer at MIT. And he's got an organization called presencing.org. And it helps us identify, clarify, and be able to respond to the opportunities that develop, that emerge. They talk about emergence through the disruption of change. And if there's ever been a time in my life, and I don't know what it was like, and I don't know how many of you remember what it was like, the change that was going on in the aftermath during World War II and the aftermath of World War II. But there's certainly been nothing quite like that. Well, I can't say that. The 60s were pretty rough, right? The 60s had their... But since the 60s, right, there's not been this kind of disruption. I grew up close enough to Boulder to understand what the hippie revolution was about, and the sexual revolution, and the anti-war protests, and all that going on. And I'm in a little small farm town, who really resisted that stuff, right? Our boys were coming back from Vietnam in caskets, while these kids were protesting the war instead of going and fighting like, the good people in my church thought they should. Good old Lutheran German farmers, right? We are in a portion of change. So what, basically, it is a practice, and I don't go into why it's called you and all, but what you try to do very carefully is to recognize where you're biased, where your thinking and your convictions sometimes might blind you to the reality. Now, think about all the things we're doing, narrative, where our thinking might blind us to what God is calling us to. So you have to learn to set aside and identify where you might be biased, even in your practices, in your theologies, in your adherence or your insistence on maybe a certain liturgy or a certain way of doing church, not to disrupt them away, but to say, oh, I see how that can be blinding. It can keep me focused only here. I'm going to set that aside enough to sort of see where other stuff might filter in. And then you're emotional. What are the emotional triggers I have? Why do people get so upset when church goes 62 minutes? No, seriously, there are people, that's a huge emotional trigger, right? Oh my God, it's 62 minutes, we got to go. Why is that? Why do some people get really upset when we don't kneel? I'm just saying, those are real things. But some of that stirs emotions. Why do we get angry when something happens? So if we can do the work on our own selves together and start to identify where my anger's coming from, because it's always grounded in something, usually most always grounded in something else, right? Why do I get uncomfortable every time I step into an ICU? Emotionally, I know why. Because I was a young man who lost, my wife, and spent way too many nights in an ICU, 57 in a row. I slept on the cot because I was loyal, right? I know that's my trigger. I've had to do a lot of work to get to that. I know that it's irrational for me to hate. It's irrational for me, but I really do dislike the Raiders. I don't know why. I have to the Oakland Raiders. I'm a Denver Bronco fan. Why do those things? Why do the Jayhawks and the Raiders and the Kansas City Chiefs give me fits? Because it's just football. But no, I have to do the work on that sometimes. Okay? And when you can begin to do the work as individuals and as systems, why are we as a group so opposed to this, right? When you begin to identify it enough to set it aside, not to jettison again, just to set it aside, what happens is you are in a position where you might be more present, that they call it presencing. You're just more available as a community, as a person, to what might be emerging. Now, tied with the Lydian way and all the things we're talking about, that emergence usually is we hope and we trust and we hope and trust that is the Spirit at work. And so we were aware enough, we've been doing a little bit of this work, and this woman comes in and wants us to go over it. It changed the nature of who we were. It probably signed our death knell in a lot of ways, because we never did continue on the path, as Lydia, of what the church, the ELCA, considers a valid congregation under development. Because one, we didn't have a building, really. Two, we weren't being self-supported by the giving of our members. Three, we didn't have a large membership because we didn't even worry about members and membership, because we had the people involved in the work in the neighborhood, the work of God's in feeding and advocacy and all those things, were way bigger than the 8 or 10 or 12 of us who get regularly to worship, right? We didn't meet those dynamics. We didn't meet those number limits, meet the criteria, so eventually we lost our funding. And so then we had to quit being Lydia Place, and that's when we formed this separate nonprofit. Nobody gets paid, but we still have people give money, and we use it for things. We find ways to use the money.
And then COVID hit,
Yeah, COVID hit.
and that changes the world too.
So, the last thing I'll talk about, oh, it's 12:12.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I gotta go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the last thing I'll just real quickly is that it's very, quite often, churches and organizations get caught up on the what and the how of what things are doing. What are we doing, right? We're doing a food program. That's a good what, right? How are we going to do it? That's when things, how are we going to do that, you know? That's where things start to boil down. But we very rarely talk about why. What is the center of the why? Why do we do the things we do? In many churches and many organizations is but why is, what is the ultimate purpose? What drives and motivates us as a community? And this is what Lydia, this is the why we do what we do continually. And this really is my why. Same thing. I believe that the Holy Spirit is the main actor. And that Spirit is forming. It's not a done deal. It's always forming Christ's church. But that church is being formed out of what God's preferred future is. It's not being formed out of the past. It's always in a manner. That's the Reformation ideal, right? It's always reforming. That the Holy Spirit is active and working to continue to form Christ's church out of where God wants the future to be. And that's a different way to think about things. So there's that's an insight on your pastor that this is 10 years, 12 years of work just to get to that point. But it does drive me. That's my why for ministry.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What are you doing here? Why did you accept this call? A middle-class church, no Hmong representative, no blacks. So there's one? Okay, one black. And you want to push us forward, understood, but why did you even start with us?
Well, one, I don't want to push you forward. I want us to together find out where God is calling us, and then us to go. That's a different thing. I don't want to push us forward. I want us to work where we... But the reason I took the call is the nature of call is I just don't go looking for my own call. Call comes primarily to the pastor from the synod, and they're identifying places they think my gifts might be work.
Oh.
I don't apply for a job.
Oh, right.
Because if I apply for a job, sometimes I'm going to be so caught up in whom I am.
Yep.
So the way the process goes is I was actually interviewing somewhere else for an interim role when all of a sudden I got a call from the synod saying, let's put this interim invitation on top. I'd interviewed. I'd actually interviewed. And we were beginning to talk finances. And they said, we've got a congregation that we think your gifts might suit. And when I got here, Sherry was there. Mary, you were there, right?
No.
You were,
Sherry, Carol, Katie, Jamie, and Paul.
Paul. Oh, and yeah, Carol.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was Carol Fontaine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when I first read the document, what I was really thinking, I was praying about it, and what happened is I saw that there were some things here that just, what did I notice, right? What stood out for me? John Glenn,
Shores,
the Shores,
Cardigan Ridge,
yeah, all those things, but also
Al-Anon.
but also that This was a congregation that had remained fairly, as I learned, very much same old for 3 decades. I know there was change as you went.
Yeah.
There's always change. But there was sort of a similarity. And the other thing I noticed as I did more research is that this was a congregation that, outside of a couple people, you know, I'd ask colleagues, what do you know about Cross? Nothing. Who is the pastor there? I don't know. These are people in the Synod, right? Because you had your previous pastor, as lovely as he was, wasn't engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that the church, my call to the church, and our call as Lutherans, is not only to the individual congregation, but we are one church as a Synod, we are one church as an ELCA. So we occupy those 3 expressions of church. We're a huge mega church. You know, 4.7 million member mega church. We just don't see ourselves that way. With 9,000 sites. That's the ELCA in a nutshell. So that's why, Peter. Because when I met with the people, when I practiced setting aside some of my biases and some of my preconceptions about the neighborhood or the building or anything, I started thinking about what might be God doing here, and I just felt God was doing something. And the call came from the church to invite me. And all I had to do was say yes or no. And the invitation to interview was through the Synod, not me. That's how the process works. And I trusted in the process. Would I have gone to Cross had I been sort of a free-for-all? I don't know. You know, I probably would have looked for something snazzier.
Well, and, you know, if ELCA...
With working internet.
Yeah.
If the Synod is the one that, I mean, we even sent our information to the Synod. So, you know, I mean, we interviewed...
I was the 4th round, I think.
I think we interviewed 6 people. And,
6 before me, I think, actually.
Yeah.
And for some reason, nobody, either you didn't think it was the right fit, your call committee, or that person didn't think it was the right fit.
Right.
And it's got to be a fit.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to say, though, is I think that this is a community. I felt that all these ideas that I've been working on, these practices, these different practices, these different approaches, really were things that a congregation like this, in time, it'll work. I really trust that they'll work. I can't just come in and introduce them all. I can't just come in and say, this is what we're going to do. But you build it over time.
Well, we could work on that internet though, right?
Oh,
That internet.
Hey.
If you're at home, so you can watch and you
And I
can hear.
screwed up today. I left the
hear.
camera on
Yeah.
a portion of, you
Yeah.
know.
But-
I don't do internet.
Yeah. I watch it on the computer at times, and it's like, oh man, we got to get that sound fixed.
Oh yeah, well that's happening. We have that $5,000 grant.
That'll be a big help.
I'm ordering everything this
Oh.
week. I should have it not everything, but should have it by the end of the week. My hope is to have the sound fixed before Easter Sunday.
Yeah.
We're going to get a new mixer and rethink sound because what we have is just limited in the way we can manage. I know your knees will be hurting, Jim. When I talk, people's knees hurt.
Yeah.
You ever notice? I preach, we go up to the rail, and nobody wants to kneel. I think I'm hurting everybody's knees with my preaching somehow.
I told Jamie to kneel. I said, if you want to kneel, kneel. She says, don't I have to wait? I said, don't wait.
Well,
And that's what we're used to.
Yeah,
I know.
we're used to somebody
We're
telling us to
invited
kneel.
to kneel, you know.
I had never done it that way since I was in the Missouri Synod Church when I was a kid. Every other church I've served in one way or another here in the ELCA,
Mhm.
since my days in the ELCA, most churches do the continuous worship, which I like that. But those who kneel do at the table, it's a continuous at the table. It's not by, people come up, there's
Not
a
by
space,
side.
they just kneel down.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm getting used to this dance.
I was just going to say, this was the Missouri Synod
I know.
Church before, and I think a lot of things got carried over.
Oh,
I
sure.
mean, a lot of things.
I think Bob probably, now who was before Bob, Timmerman?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Timmerman was during the transition, so some of those things probably changed, and then Pastor Bob comes over,
Yeah.
right? And I'll bet you that he just kept some of those things just
Oh, yeah.
because it was...
Hard, easier than saying,
Yeah, so that's why,
excuse
Peter,
me,
that's-
we're gonna have some change here.
It's part of giving up control.
That's right.
And I don't know. Maybe in 5 years, the ELCA comes to me and says, we got something else for you. I don't know, that happens. Maybe